8:17 p.m. The Tuesday shift at the Northwood Public Library always ended 15 minutes after closing, just enough time for 17-year-old Maya to wheel the returns cart back to the circulation desk, wipe down the computer terminals with a sanitizing cloth that smelled faintly of lemon and ammonia, and lock the heavy oak doors behind her. The click of the deadbolt was a sound of finality, a seal on the quiet, ordered world of books she loved. Outside, the world was anything but quiet and ordered. Her 1998 Honda Civic, a car the color of a faded sky, coughed to life under the flickering orange glow of a parking lot lamp. It was a good car, a car her grandfather maintained with meticulous care, but it was old, and it felt fragile against the encroaching darkness of the industrial park side of town. The immediate sensory jolt came 3 blocks later, on Elm Street. A sudden, blinding glare of high-intensity discharge headlights flooded her rearview mirror, washing out the reflection of her own tired face. The light was followed by a sound, a deep, guttural rumble that wasn't just heard but felt, a vibration that ran up the steering column and into her hands. A black Dodge Charger, low and wide and predatory, was plastered to her bumper. She tapped her brakes, a polite signal. The Charger surged forward, its grille seeming to fill her entire rear window. Laughter, distorted by the glass and the engine's roar, reached her ears. 2 silhouettes were visible inside, one holding up a phone, the red dot of a recording light a malevolent eye in the darkness. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage of bone. This was the 3rd time this week. She made a right onto 4th Avenue, a street she didn't need to take, hoping they were just joyriders who would continue straight. They didn't. The Charger stayed with her, a shadow tethered by malice. She saw the bright, sterile sanctuary of a 24-hour gas station ahead and pulled in, her tires crunching over loose gravel. She wouldn't get gas. She would just sit under the lights where there were cameras and people. Surely they wouldn't follow her there. They did. They parked 2 spaces away, their engine a throbbing, menacing idle. Her own engine was off, and the sudden relative silence made her feel even more vulnerable, every beat of her heart a drum signaling her fear. Across the 4 lanes of traffic, a police cruiser was parked at a donut shop, its presence a comforting blue and white promise of order. The officer inside was a silhouette, too, but his was motionless, head tilted back, sipping from a paper cup. He wasn't looking. He didn't see. Or if he did, it registered as nothing more than late-night teenage antics. The 2 young men got out of the Charger. They were lean, dressed in expensive tracksuits, their faces obscured by the glare of the station's canopy lights. They didn't approach her car, not yet. They leaned against their own, arms crossed, watching her, their smirks catching the light. They were waiting. They were enjoying this. They knew she was trapped, but someone else was watching, too. From the shadows of a closed auto body shop across from the donut shop, a man sat astride a Harley-Davidson Road Glide, the chrome muted in the darkness. He wore a leather vest, heavy and worn, with a distinctive patch on the back that was unreadable from a distance. He had seen the black Charger before. He had heard the stories, the whispers from other members who worked night shifts or drove trucks through these same streets. He saw Maya's small car, saw the terror in the rigid set of her shoulders. He saw the police officer doing nothing. He lifted a phone to his ear, his voice a low rumble that was lost in the ambient noise of the city. "Yeah, it's me," he said. "Elm and 4th. That black Charger is back, harassing the kid from the library again." The girl with the old Honda, he listened for a moment. "No, cops are right here." Useless, he ended the call, his thumb pressing the screen with quiet finality. He didn't move. He just watched, a silent, patient sentinel, his presence an unanswered question in the humid night air. Maya waited for 10 minutes that felt like 10 hours. The 2 men finally got back in their car, revved the engine one last time in a final act of intimidation, and peeled out of the gas station, leaving a strip of rubber on the pavement. She didn't feel relief. She felt a cold, creeping certainty that this wasn't over. She drove straight to the Northwood Police Department, a squat brick building that smelled of stale coffee and disinfectant. The lobby was empty except for a desk sergeant whose nameplate read, Blevins. He had a thick neck that bulged over his collar and eyes that seemed permanently narrowed in suspicion. She told her story, her voice trembling at first, then steadying as the injustice of it all hardened her resolve. She described the car, the harassment, the feeling of being hunted. Blevins listened with an expression of profound boredom, tapping a pen on a worn blotter. "A black Charger, you say?" he asked, his tone dripping with condescension. "There's about 1,000 of those in this county, miss." "It had tinted windows and was very loud," she offered, feeling foolish for stating the obvious. "They all do," he grunted. "Did they hit your vehicle? Did they threaten you verbally? Did they display a weapon?" "No, but they cut me off, they brake-checked me, they followed me." "Boys being boys," Blevins interrupted, the phrase landing like a slap. "Probably just trying to get your attention. Maybe they thought you were cute." The implication was clear. This was somehow her fault. A wave of hot shame washed over her, followed by a surge of anger. "They were trying to scare me, and they succeeded. They had me cornered at the gas station, but they didn't do anything," he countered, leaning back in his chair, which groaned under his weight. "No crime was committed here. What do you want me to write in the report? A car drove near another car? I want you to find them," she said, her voice small but firm. "I got a partial plate number." She gave him the 3 letters and 2 numbers she had managed to glimpse in her mirror. He typed them into his computer with a theatrical slowness, his thick fingers pecking at the keyboard one at a time. He stared at the screen for a moment. "Nothing," he announced with a hint of satisfaction. "Doesn't match any vehicle registered in this county. Probably a stolen plate. Or you wrote it down wrong." He swiveled his chair back to face her, his expression one of finality. "Look, unless they actually do something, my hands are tied. My advice? Take a different route home. Don't engage. Most of the time, if you ignore them, they get bored and go away." He was dismissing her. He was framing calculated cruelty as a childish game and her legitimate fear as feminine hysteria. She stood there for a moment, the official indifference of the institution pressing down on her. The uniform, the badge, the seal of the city on the wall, it all meant nothing. It was a facade, and behind it was just a tired, cynical man who couldn't be bothered. She walked out of the station, the heavy glass doors closing behind her with a soft whoosh. The night air felt colder now. The fear she had felt in the car was bad, but this was worse. This was the chilling realization that the people who were supposed to help you wouldn't. She was completely, utterly alone. The system had looked away, and in doing so, it had given the men in the black Charger permission to continue. Maya's world was a small, carefully constructed one, built on a foundation of routine and responsibility. She lived with her grandfather, Frank, in a tiny 2-bedroom bungalow on the west side of town, a house her grandmother had filled with potted geraniums and the smell of baking bread before she passed. Now it just smelled of Frank's coffee and the linseed oil he used to condition his old leather tools. Frank was 72, a retired master mechanic whose hands, though now gnarled and stiff with arthritis, could still diagnose an engine's ailment by sound alone. He had been the one to find her the Honda, spending a month of weekends rebuilding the engine and transmission until it ran. As he said, like a Swiss watch, he was a man of quiet principles, a believer in honest work, paying your debts, and looking out for your own. His code was simple: you do the right thing, especially when it's hard. Her parents were a ghost in the house, present only in a single framed photograph on the mantelpiece. They were smiling, young and vibrant, leaning against a classic Ford Mustang at a car show. They had died in a head-on collision with a drunk driver when Maya was 6. That loss had shaped both her and Frank. It was the unspoken reason for his fierce protectiveness, for the slight tremor in his hand whenever she took the car keys, and for the deep, primal fear that gripped her when the black Charger was on her tail. Her fear wasn't just about harassment. It was about the sudden, violent randomness of the road, the fragility of steel and glass and life. Maya's room was her sanctuary. One wall was covered in bookshelves crammed with everything from classic literature to modern physics textbooks. Another was dedicated to her own charcoal sketches of vintage cars, a 57 Bel Air, a 69 Camaro, a 32 Ford Coupe. She had her grandfather's eye for mechanical beauty. A small desk was cluttered with scholarship applications and textbooks for the advanced placement classes she was taking. She worked 20 hours a week at the library, not for pocket money, but to help Frank with the bills that seemed to grow larger every year, and to save every extra dollar for a state university, for a future that felt both impossibly distant and terrifyingly close. She was a good kid. She didn't go to parties. She didn't cause trouble. She didn't give anyone a reason to notice her. All she wanted was to be left alone to navigate the path she had so carefully laid for herself. The harassment felt like a violation of that quiet contract. It was a force of chaos intruding on her ordered world, and the dismissal by Officer Blevins was a confirmation that the world's rules didn't apply to everyone equally. When she told Frank what the officer had said, she saw a look on his face she hadn't seen in years, a flicker of the helpless rage he'd worn in the days after his daughter's death. "Boys being boys," he repeated, the words tasting like poison in his mouth. He slammed his fist on the kitchen table, a muted thud of flesh and bone against worn oak. "That's the excuse of lazy men who let predators run wild." He looked at his own hands, curled into useless fists. "There was a time I would have handled this myself, but that time was gone." His strength had faded, replaced by the dull ache in his joints. He was no longer a man who could physically defend his granddaughter. He was just an old man, and his powerlessness was a constant, bitter ache. The stakes were no longer just about a scary drive home. They were about their life together, about the sanctuary of their small home, about Frank's peace of mind, and about Maya's belief in a just world. A belief that was eroding with every passing day. The following Monday it happened again. This time, they were waiting for her as she pulled out of the library parking lot. The black Charger fell in behind her, its engine a familiar, sickening growl. She had taken Blevins's advice and mapped out a different route home, one that took her down busier, better-lit streets. It didn't matter. They stayed with her, more brazen than before. As she passed under an overpass, something struck her passenger side door with a loud, metallic clang. She flinched, jerking the wheel. In her rearview mirror, she saw them laughing as a red soda can bounced across the pavement. When she got home, she saw the dent. It was small, but it was a perfect circle of violation in the otherwise smooth, faded blue paint. It was a mark, a brand. Frank saw it and his face tightened, his lips a thin, white line. He ran his trembling fingers over the indentation, his touch both tender and furious. "This is it," he said, his voice low. "This is Escalation." Maya began documenting everything with a desperate, methodical precision. She bought a small notebook and a pen, keeping them in the passenger seat. In it, she recorded dates, times, locations, and descriptions of each incident. The tailgating on Elm Street, the chase down 4th Avenue, the soda can on the overpass. Her entries were stark, factual, stripped of emotion, as if the clinical nature of the record-keeping could somehow distance her from the terror. She tried to use her phone to get evidence, but it was nearly impossible. While driving, holding the phone steady enough to get a clear shot of the license plate in her mirror was a fool's errand. The images were always a blur of light and motion. One evening, she parked across the street from the library before her shift, waiting, hoping to get a picture of the car while it was stationary. She waited for an hour, but it never appeared. It was as if they knew her schedule, knew her routines, and chose their moments with a cruel, deliberate intelligence. She called the police non-emergency line twice more that week. The first time, she reported the dent from the soda can. The dispatcher asked if she had seen who threw it. "It came from the car that's been following me," Maya explained. "But did you see it leave the occupant's hand and strike your vehicle?" the dispatcher asked, her voice flat and procedural. Maya had to admit she hadn't. "Then we can't prove it wasn't just road debris, ma'am." The second call was after they followed her for her entire 20-minute drive home. Never passing, never backing off, just staying in her blind spot. A constant, menacing presence. "They haven't broken any laws, ma'am," the new voice on the line told her. "It's a public road. We can't stop someone from driving on it. Each call was a new layer of frustration, a new brick in the wall of institutional indifference. Frank knew the town. He'd lived in Northwood his entire life. He knew its secrets, its power structures. After a few quiet inquiries with old friends at the garage and the local diner, his suspicions hardened into a grim certainty. The car belonged to the Thorne family. Marcus Thorne was a real estate developer who had reshaped the town skyline with luxury condos and glass-fronted office buildings. He moved through the world with the frictionless ease of the very wealthy, his campaign donations ensuring the loyalty of the city council and, by extension, the police chief, a man named Henderson whom Thorne had personally recommended for the job. Thorne had 2 sons, both in their early 20s, with reputations for arrogance and a reckless sense of entitlement. "It's Thorne's boys," Frank told Maya, his voice heavy. "That's why Blevins couldn't find the plate. It was probably flagged in the system." Disregard. A professional courtesy, the knowledge changed everything. This wasn't random cruelty. It was privileged cruelty, protected and enabled by the very system designed to prevent it. The audience's frustration mirrored Frank's. The helplessness was suffocating. Maya wasn't just being harassed by 2 delinquents. She was being crushed by the weight of a corrupt system. A system that valued a rich man's convenience over a young girl's safety. The fear was no longer just in the car. It was in her home. It was the sound of every car that slowed down on their street, the dread that settled in her stomach as the sun went down each day. Frank spent a long night sitting in his worn armchair, the house dark except for the small lamp that cast long shadows on the wall. He stared at the phone on the side table, a simple landline with large buttons. He was caught in a painful calculus of risk. On one side was Maya's escalating terror. On the other was a phone number he hadn't dialed in over a decade, a number that represented a different kind of power, a different code of justice, one that operated far outside the clean, well-lit offices of the city's corrupt officials. Years ago, a man who called himself Bear had brought a 1948 Harley-Davidson Panhead into Frank's shop. The bike's frame had a hairline crack near the steering head, a flaw so subtle that 3 other mechanics had missed it. It was a death trap waiting to happen. Bear was the president of the Northwood Charter of the Hells Angels. Frank knew who he was. He also knew good craftsmanship. He spent 2 weeks meticulously repairing the frame, reinforcing it with a custom-fabricated gusset, his welds so clean they looked like a stack of dimes. When he was done, he charged Bear for the materials and nothing more. "Professional courtesy," Frank had said. Using the same words, he now spat like a curse. Bear had looked him in the eye, a long, appraising stare. "A debt is a debt," he'd said. "You ever need anything, you call." Frank hadn't thought he ever would. Calling Bear wasn't like calling a friend for a favor. It was like flipping a switch on a machine you didn't fully understand, one you might not be able to turn off. But as he thought of Maya's face, pale and strained in the dim light of the hallway, the risk seemed to diminish. The system had failed. He had to operate outside of it. He picked up the receiver, his arthritic fingers fumbling slightly as he dialed the number he had memorized all those years ago. It rang twice. A gruff voice answered. "Yeah, I'm looking for Bear," Frank said, his own voice sounding thin to his ears. "Who's asking?" "My name is Frank. I'm a mechanic. I fixed a panhead frame for him a long time ago." There was a pause. Frank could hear the sound of a television in the background. Then the voice changed, a note of recognition, of respect, entering it. "Hold on." Another minute passed. Then a new voice, deeper and calmer, came on the line. "Frank, it's been a while." "Bear?" Frank said, relief making him momentarily lightheaded. "I need to talk to you." He didn't embellish. He didn't plead. He laid out the facts with the same precision he would use to diagnose a faulty engine. He described the black Charger, the harassment, the dented door, his granddaughter's fear. He told him about Officer Blevins, about the dead-end partial plate search, and about his certainty that it was Marcus Thorne's sons. He laid his own powerlessness bare. "I'm an old man," he finished, the admission costing him a piece of his pride. "I can't protect her anymore. I'm not asking you to break any laws. I'm not asking for violence." He took a breath. "I'm asking for eyes. Just eyes on her, so she knows she's not alone. So they know she's not alone. There was a long silence on the other end of the line. Frank's heart pounded. Maybe he had miscalculated. Maybe the code of honor he believed in was just a sentimental fantasy. Then Bear spoke, his voice a low gravel. The girl with the old blue Honda. The one who works at the library, it wasn't a question. We've seen the car, Bear continued, and Frank understood that the call he was making wasn't the beginning of the story, but the middle. The man who had been watching from the shadows that first night was one of Bear's men. We know who they are. We know who their father is. And we know what the cops won't do. The code had been triggered. A debt of respect, owed for a perfect weld a decade ago, was being called in. You did the right thing calling, Frank, Bear said. You tell your granddaughter not to worry. We'll handle it. The word handle was delivered with an unnerving calm. It wasn't a promise of brutality. It was a promise of order, a promise to restore a balance that the town's appointed guardians had allowed to be broken. The mobilization began with a series of quiet, two-word text messages. Friday, 7 p.m. From Bear's phone to a dozen others. Library detail. The responses were equally brief. Copy. On it. Confirmed. The messages daisy-chained through the charter's network. A silent, digital call to arms. Across the county, in garages filled with the scent of gasoline and old leather, lights flickered on. We see a close-up of a gnarled hand polishing a chrome exhaust pipe until it gleams like a mirror. Another shot of a man methodically checking the tension of his bike's drive chain. Leather vests, stiff and heavy with the weight of patches and time, were pulled from hooks. The death head patch, the symbol that struck fear in many, was now being donned in the service of a quiet, terrified girl. The scale of the response began to build, marked by the rising headcount of engines turning over. For bikes rumbled to life in a suburban cul-de-sac. They met 8 more at a highway on-ramp. The growing pack of 12 rode in a tight, disciplined formation, their headlights cutting through the twilight, their sound a unified, percussive roar that spoke of immense, controlled power. Their rendezvous point was a disused warehouse on the industrial outskirts of town, a place of corrugated steel and broken windows. One by one, they pulled in, parking their machines in neat, orderly rows. There was no loud talk, no boisterous shouting. There was only the quiet clink of kickstands on concrete and the low murmur of men who understood the mission without needing lengthy explanation. The final head count was 20. 20 men, 20 machines. A formidable presence. Meanwhile, in a small downtown apartment, Sarah Jensen's phone buzzed on her coffee table. She was a freelance journalist, a blogger who ran a local news site called The Northwood Watch. For months, she had been digging into Marcus Thorne's questionable land deals, hitting a wall of sealed documents and official stonewalling at every turn. The text was from an anonymous source, one she had cultivated inside the Hells Angels charter, a man who occasionally fed her information that the club wanted to see in the light of day. The message was cryptic. Town Hall, 9 p.m. Bring your camera. Don't be late. Sarah knew this was it. This was the break she had been waiting for. She grabbed her camera bag, her heart racing with a mixture of fear and journalistic excitement. At the warehouse, Bear stood before his men, his large frame silhouetted against the single bare bulb that lit the space. He laid out the plan. It was a plan of presence, not violence, of exposure, not revenge. We are not vigilantes, he said, his voice echoing slightly in the cavernous space. Tonight, we are witnesses. The law says a citizen needs evidence to get help. Tonight, we are going to be that evidence. The plan was simple, a piece of tactical theater designed for maximum public impact. They would escort Maya home, not by riding with her, but by creating a perimeter. They would be a silent, unassailable wall of steel and leather. They would use their phones, not their fists. They would document everything, creating an unimpeachable record of the harassment, the car, the license plate, and the faces of the perpetrators. They would do the job the Northwood Police Department had refused to do. No one, Bear said, his eyes scanning the faces of his men, lays a hand on anyone. We are seen, we are heard, and we are lawful. Is that clear? A chorus of low, Affirmative grunts was his answer. The machine was primed. The purpose was clear. They were about to turn their fearsome reputation into an instrument of public accountability. 8:45 p.m. The heavy oak doors of the library closed behind Maya, the familiar click of the lock doing little to soothe the knot of anxiety in her stomach. The drive home loomed before her like a dark tunnel with no visible end. She walked to her Honda, her keys clutched so tightly in her fist that the metal teeth bit into her palm. She slid into the driver's seat, the worn fabric a cold comfort. She took a deep, shaky breath and turned the key. The engine caught, its familiar, humble hum a stark contrast to the roar that haunted her thoughts. As she shifted into reverse, a pair of brilliant white headlights flashed to life at the far end of the parking lot. The black Charger. It surged forward, its tires spitting gravel, and screeched to a halt, perfectly positioned to block the only exit. Her blood ran cold. This was different. Before, they had been a shadow behind her. Now they were a wall in front of her. The engine cut out, and the sudden silence was terrifying. The doors of the Charger opened in unison. Two figures emerged, their faces illuminated by the orange security lights. It was the first time she had seen them clearly. They were young, no more than a few years older than her, with the easy arrogance of boys who had never been told no. They wore smirks that were both casual and cruel. They started walking toward her car, their pace unhurried, savoring her fear. Maya's hand flew to the door lock, pressing it down with a click that sounded deafeningly loud in the small car. Her mind raced. Call the police? They wouldn't get here in time. Honk the horn? Who would hear? Then she felt it before she heard it. A low, deep vibration in the asphalt. A tremor that seemed to rise up through the tires and into the frame of her car. It grew steadily, a distant rumble becoming a physical presence. It was the sound of a coming storm. A single, powerful headlight appeared at the mouth of the street, then another, and another. One by one, a column of motorcycles turned into the library's access road. They moved with a slow, deliberate, almost ceremonial grace. They fanned out, forming a perfect, silent crescent around the parking lot. Their headlights a solid wall of blinding light that pinned the black Charger and the two young men in a harsh, unforgiving spotlight. The exits were sealed. The bikers cut their engines. All 20 of them. The sudden, profound silence was more intimidating than the roar had been. They just sat there, astride their machines, a silent, formidable jury of leather and chrome. The two young men froze mid-stride. Their smirks evaporated, replaced by masks of disbelief, then dawning fear. They looked from the bikes to each other, their confident swagger gone, replaced by the panicked uncertainty of cornered animals. Across the street, patrons of a late-night diner pressed against the glass, their faces curious, then shocked. A car slowed, its driver gawking at the strange, tense tableau. From the shadows near the diner, Sarah Jensen raised her camera, the telephoto lens capturing the scene with crystal clarity. The click of her shutter was inaudible, but its impact would be deafening. The public confrontation had begun, not with a shout, but with a wall of silent, disciplined power. Bear swung his leg over his bike, his boots landing on the pavement with a soft, solid thud. He was a mountain of a man, broad-shouldered and thick-limbed, but he moved with a surprising, deliberate grace. He didn't stride. He walked, each step measured and calm. He ignored Thorne's sons completely, his gaze fixed on the back of their Charger as if they were nothing more than insignificant scenery. He walked to the rear of the car and stopped, standing directly in front of the license plate. The two young men watched him, paralyzed, their bravado having crumbled into a chalky white fear. Bear pulled a smartphone from the inside pocket of his vest. He held it up, the screen's light illuminating his rugged, bearded face. With a steady hand, he took a clear, perfectly focused, high-resolution photograph of the license plate. The flash was a small, bright explosion in the tense quiet. Then, he slowly turned and took another photograph, this one of the two young men, their deer-in-the-headlights expressions captured for posterity. He lowered the phone and spoke, his voice not a shout, but a low, gravelly rumble that carried with absolute clarity in the stillness of the parking lot. "This is a 2022 Dodge Charger Hellcat," he announced, as if dictating a police report. He looked down at the plate. The license plate reads 6, Tango, Hotel, Oscar, Romeo, November, Echo 1. He spelled it out, letter by letter. A vanity plate. Chwarny 1. He paused, letting the name hang in the air. He then looked up, his eyes finding the lens of Sarah Jensen's camera across the street. He knew she was there. He was speaking directly to her audience, to the entire town. "Funny how Officer Blevins at the Northwood Police Department couldn't find that in the system," he continued, his voice laced with cold irony. "For 3 weeks, the occupants of this vehicle have been stalking and terrorizing a 17-year-old girl on her way home from her job. Right here, at the public library." He held up his own phone, displaying the picture of the license plate on the screen. "The police were called multiple times. They said there was no evidence. They said nothing could be done." He swept his arm out, a gesture that encompassed the silent, watching bikers. "Here's the evidence. And here are 20 witnesses." It was at that moment that the distant wail of a siren finally began to cut through the night. The sound grew closer, frantic and loud. 2 police cruisers screeched into the access road, their blue and red lights painting the scene in chaotic, flashing colors. The doors flew open and officers emerged, hands on their holstered weapons. Behind them, a third vehicle, an unmarked sedan, pulled up. Police Chief Henderson himself got out. He was a man accustomed to control, but his face was a mask of shock as he took in the scene. The wall of bikers, the trapped Charger, the crowd of onlookers, and Sarah Jensen, her camera still trained on him. He saw the Thorn car, and his expression went from shocked to rigid. He knew exactly whose car that was. He knew exactly what this public spectacle meant. The comfortable, corrupt denial he had allowed to fester under his command was now exposed, brilliantly and brutally, under 100,000 lumens of motorcycle headlights. The mask of systemic failure was ripped away for all to see. The fallout was immediate and catastrophic for the town's complacent power structure. Sarah Jensen's blog post, titled "The Night the Angels Guarded the Library," went live at 11:30 p.m. It contained the high-resolution photos, the video of Bear's calm, damning speech, and a meticulously researched timeline of Maya's ignored pleas to the police department. By morning, it had been shared thousands of times. It was the only thing anyone in Northwood was talking about. The story was too compelling, the imagery too powerful for the regional news outlets to ignore. A TV news van from the city was parked outside the police station by noon the next day. The public pressure was a tidal wave. Faced with a full-blown scandal, the mayor and city council had no choice but to act. An emergency session was called, and they announced the launch of a formal internal affairs investigation into the Northwood Police Department's handling of the entire affair. Officer Blevins was the first to fall. He was placed on administrative leave, a suspension that everyone knew was the first step toward a forced resignation. The official dispatch logs, which Sarah Jensen had filed a Freedom of Information Act request for, were suddenly made available. They showed Maya's calls, logged and timestamped, followed by the damning notation, "No action required. The record of Blevins's unsuccessful search for the partial plate number was a smoking gun." And then, miraculously, the full registration for the vanity plate 6 Thorn 1 reappeared in the DMV database, linked directly to a holding company owned by Marcus Thorn. Thorn tried to kill the story. His high-priced lawyers sent cease and desist letters to Sarah and made threatening calls to the local news stations. But the narrative was out of his control. The video of his 2 sons, their faces pale with fear as they were confronted not by a fearsome gang, but by the consequences of their own actions, was too powerful. They were arrested 2 days later. The charges were stalking, reckless endangerment, and felony menacing. Their father posted their bail, but the damage was done. The Thorn family's carefully constructed image of civic leadership lay in ruins. Throughout the entire affair, not a single member of the Hells Angels was charged with a crime. They had assembled peacefully. They had obstructed no one. They had issued no threats. They had simply been present. In the court of public opinion, They were not thugs. They were the heroes of the story, a disciplined force that had stepped into a moral vacuum left by a failed institution. They had become, in the eyes of many frustrated citizens, a symbol of necessary and just intervention. A few days after the incident, Maya went to the station with Frank to give her formal statement to the internal affairs investigators. She walked into the same building where she had been dismissed and humiliated, but this time, she was not a victim begging for help. She was the calm, clear-eyed center of the storm. She laid out the facts, referencing the small notebook she now carried with her, her voice steady and sure. Frank sat beside her, his hand resting on her shoulder, his pride in her a palpable presence in the sterile interrogation room. Her dignity, which had been chipped away by fear and indifference, was fully restored. She had not been rescued. She had endured until her courage ignited the spark of collective action. 6 months later, the town of Northwood was a different place. The ripples from that night in the library parking lot had spread, reshaping institutions and attitudes. The internal affairs investigation had concluded, leading to the early retirement of Police Chief Henderson and the implementation of a sweeping set of departmental reforms. The most visible of these was a new community outreach program, officially named the Youth Safety Initiative, but known colloquially by everyone in town as the Library Initiative. It established a direct, confidential hotline and online portal for young people to report harassment, bypassing the traditional front desk bureaucracy and ensuring that no complaint would ever again be dismissed as boys being boys. Marcus Thorne's empire began to crumble under the weight of unwanted scrutiny. Sarah Jensen, empowered by her newfound prominence, used the Thorne scandal as a lever to pry open sealed city records. Her follow-up investigations revealed a pattern of bribery and backroom deals connected to his development projects. Several lucrative city contracts were canceled, and a grand jury was convened to investigate his ties to members of the city council. The fear that had once protected him was gone, replaced by the bright, disinfecting light of public accountability. Maya thrived. She was awarded the prestigious Northwood Civic Scholarship, a full ride to the state university, funded by a newly formed and anonymous community trust. The local paper speculated that the fund was backed by a consortium of local business owners who were tired of the old guard's corruption, but Maya suspected the truth was simpler and had more to do with the quiet respect of a certain motorcycle club. She declared her intention to major in pre-law, a decision that surprised no one who knew her story. Her beat-up Honda Civic still carried her to and from the library for her last few shifts before she left for college. The circular dent on the passenger door, however, was gone. One morning, she had come out to find it perfectly repaired. The paint blended so seamlessly that it was impossible to tell there had ever been a mark. There was no note, no bill. Frank just smiled when she showed him, a knowing look in his eyes. On a warm August evening, her last night in town, Maya was driving home. She stopped at a red light at the intersection of Elm and 4th, the very corner where her ordeal had so often begun. As she waited, a low, familiar rumble filled the air. A single Harley-Davidson Road Glide pulled up in the lane beside her. The rider was bare. He wore his leather vest, his face weathered and calm. He didn't rev his engine or make any grand gesture. He simply turned his head and looked at her. Their eyes met for a brief moment across the space between car and bike. He gave a slow, single nod, a gesture of profound, unspoken respect. It was a recognition of her courage, an acknowledgement of their strange, shared victory. Then the light turned green. Maya drove straight toward her future. Bear made a right turn, disappearing into the city's streets, a silent guardian returning to the shadows. The protection he offered was not gone, merely unseen, a lasting symbol that true community safety is not found in badges or institutions, but in the willingness of good people to stand together, to bear witness, and to ensure that no one is ever left to face the darkness alone.